Hello, my name is Abrafi, a physician assistant. Welcome to Health Point on Addiction. In this segment of Health Point, we are going to learn so many various diseases, certain current trends of diseases in our environment, in the country, and in the world at large. So stay tuned with me. Let's learn something on Health Point. So today we'll be talking about typhoid fever. We are going to learn so much more on what typhoid fever is, what causes typhoid fever, the signs and symptoms of typhoid fever, the various modes of transmission of typhoid fever, some investigations to do for typhoid fever, the treatments, the complications, and finally, how to prevent typhoid fever. So join me and enjoy the show with me. So the first question we are going to answer today is, what is typhoid fever? Typhoid fever, which is also known as enteric fever, is a potentially fatal multisystemic infection. I'm going to highlight fatal and I'm going to highlight multisystemic. So fatal means typhoid fever can cause death. Yes, it's that threatening. And multisystemic means typhoid fever do not affect just one system in the body. It can affect various systems in the body. That's how threatening typhoid fever is. The cause of typhoid fever is primarily by a bacteria called Salmonella typhi, and to a lesser extent, Salmonella paratyphi. Typhoid fever occurs worldwide, but most often in developing countries with poor sanitation. And typhoid fever is said to be endemic here in Africa, where Ghana falls part of Africa. So now we are going to look at the mode of transmission of typhoid fever. How do I get typhoid fever? How do you get typhoid fever? I'm going to mention 3 modes of transmissions of typhoid fever. The first one is oral transmission via food or beverages. So there are people that are chronic carriers. These chronic carriers are those that don't exhibit signs and symptoms of typhoid fever. They are asymptomatic. These people, however, chronically share these bacteria through their stools. So imagine someone being a chronic carrier and also a food handler, goes to use the washroom and has a poor hygiene and uses these same hands to come handle our food for us. We eat this food that is already contaminated by these bacteria through our mouth. Any beverage, any food goes through our mouth and we get infected with typhoid fever. That's the first mode of transmission. The second mode of transmission is the hand-to-mouth transmission. This is what we individually cause ourselves. So sometimes when we go use the washroom, instead of we washing our hands after using the washroom, we neglect these hand hygiene. Then we end up infecting our food or contaminating our food by these bacteria we pick in the washroom. Then we eat these contaminated food, then we infect ourselves with typhoid fever. The third mode of transmission is the oral transmission via contaminated sewage water. Sometimes we get our water bodies being contaminated by dropping in sewages in these water bodies, and we end up taking this water, and that predisposes us to get infected with the typhoid fever. So now that we know the mode of transmission of typhoid fever, the signs and symptoms of typhoid fever, let's look at the preventive measures of typhoid fever. This goes hand in hand with its mode of transmission, because now we can tell typhoid fever is basically about hygiene. So you make sure that anytime you use a washroom, you want to wash your hand under running water with soap. Don't neglect your hand hygiene, please. The next thing you must do is make sure any food you buy is bought from a very hygienic environment. You should deter from buying foods from an unhygienic environment, and make sure every food you buy is served hot and not cold. The next thing you must do, be careful with the kind of water you take in. Make sure the water you buy has actually gone through the right process in its filtration. and whoever that is selling the water to you is selling it to you with a clean and hygienic hands and hygienic environment too. Now to the complications of typhoid fever. What do I get when I don't treat my typhoid fever? So untreated typhoid fever can be fatal, as I mentioned earlier on in the definition of typhoid fever. If you don't treat your typhoid fever, 1, you can get delirious. That is a change in your mental activity. 2, you can have a typhoid perforation that can lead to a peritonitis. And all these are surgical definitions that will end you up on the surgical theater table where you are going to be operated on. And last but not least, typhoid fever causes death. So dear cherished viewers, now that we know what typhoid fever is, the signs and symptoms of typhoid fever, and what happens to us if we don't treat typhoid fever, I entreat you all to make sure anytime you have these signs and symptoms of typhoid fever, your first point of call is to visit the nearest facility. Go see your doctor. Let them request the basic laboratory investigation for you to do to establish the diagnosis of typhoid fever. Then the right treatment for typhoid fever be given to you to help prevent you from experiencing these complications I mentioned earlier on. Thank you all for watching Health Points on Artdiktion. If you learned a thing or two, like this video to get more of this content, and make sure your health is always your priority. See you next time on Health Point. Bye.